At 11:43 a.m., a single typed line lands on a cluttered command desk in Western Europe. 18,000 enemy prisoners secured. No operation name. No mention of a major offensive. No record of an approved order that could possibly explain that number. For several seconds, nobody speaks. 18,000 is not a skirmish. It is not a lucky break. It is the manpower of multiple divisions, surrendered intact without a headline battle to justify it. Someone quietly checks the date. Someone else checks the map. The lines do not match, because according to every plan approved that week, nothing like this was supposed to happen. Not here, not now. The war at this moment is under extreme pressure. Allied forces have broken out of Normandy, but speed has become a liability as much as an advantage. Supply lines are stretched thin, fuel arrives late, ammunition is rationed. Every mile forward increases the risk of being cut off. Command doctrine exists for a reason. Advance only when secured. Pause when logistics lag. Never outrun the map. Yet the front is no longer a clean line. It is a living thing, bending, tearing, reforming by the hour. German units are retreating, regrouping, dissolving, then reappearing where no one expects them. Intelligence reports contradict one another. Radios crackle with half-confirmed sightings. Nobody has a complete picture. And in that fog, one column has moved faster than the system can track. There is no dramatic speech, no heroic announcement, just movement. Trucks rolling before dawn. Armor pushing past villages still smoking from the night before. Infantry advancing with orders that were never formally written, only understood. The man at the center of it does not wait for consensus. He studies gaps, not objectives. He watches enemy behavior more than friendly doctrine. When he sees hesitation on the other side, he does not ask why. He asks how long it will last. His superiors know him well enough to be uneasy. He is competent, proven, effective, and dangerous to the system that manages him. He has a habit of acting first and explaining later. A habit of interpreting intent rather than reading orders word for word. A habit that has already caused quiet arguments behind closed doors. But until now, nothing he has done has forced the entire chain of command to stop and stare at a single line of text in disbelief. 18,000 prisoners do not surrender because they are defeated in battle alone. They surrender when they believe something worse is about to happen. When their reports no longer make sense. When roads they expected to retreat along are suddenly blocked. When units that should be to their left and right are simply gone. This is not destruction by firepower. It is collapse by speed. Maps are unfolded again. Fingers trace routes that were never authorized. Distances are recalculated. Timestamps are reread. At headquarters, a quiet question begins to circulate, unspoken but heavy. If this report is accurate, then someone has moved faster than doctrine allows. Faster than logistics approve. Faster than the enemy could comprehend. And if it is not accurate, then a catastrophe is unfolding just beyond the edge of official awareness. Either way, the war has shifted in a way no plan predicted. The system now faces a problem it was never designed to handle. Not failure, but success without permission. Inside higher headquarters, the first response is not celebration. It is recalculation. Maps are spread wider now, pushed to the edge of tables already crowded with fuel reports and delayed supply manifests. Officers lean in not to admire the advance, but to test it. Rulers slide across paper. Pencils circle roads that were never meant to carry that much weight that fast. The movement makes no sense on paper. According to doctrine, the unit should have paused days earlier. Fuel allocations alone should have forced a halt. Ammunition resupply was scheduled for a different axis entirely. Communications coverage drops sharply beyond the last approved line of advance. Every rule designed to prevent isolation is being violated at once. Someone says it out loud, finally. This is how units get cut off. No one disagrees. The Allied war machine is built on coordination. It rewards patience. It survives on predictability. Every success up to this point has been paid for by careful synchronization between infantry, armor, artillery, and logistics. Speed is valued, but only when it stays inside a framework that can support it. What happened here does not fit inside that framework. The problem is not that the move failed. The problem is that it worked. Reports from the field begin arriving faster than they can be processed. Prisoner counts rise by the hour. Enemy units are surrendering in clusters not after heavy fighting, but after brief contact or none at all. German officers claim their orders are outdated by the time they receive them. Retreat routes marked safe on their maps are already compromised. This is not how battles are supposed to unfold. Someone points to a familiar name on the report header, not spoken loudly, just enough to be heard by those closest. Patton, not as the man who gave the order because he did not, but as the commander whose philosophy makes this kind of behavior possible. Speed as a weapon, momentum as protection, confusion as an ally. Even so, this goes further than most are comfortable admitting. The staff understands the danger. If the enemy realizes how thin the spearhead truly is, a counterstroke could snap it clean off. One coordinated German response, one armored thrust into the flank, and the same report that caused disbelief will be replaced by another. One written in loss figures. This is why systems exist, to prevent brilliance from becoming disaster. Phones ring, messages are drafted, then redrafted. Language matters here. Too harsh and momentum is killed. Too soft and precedent is set. The question is not whether the advance was bold. Everyone sees that. The question is whether it was controllable. On the ground, the man responsible does not hear most of this. He is moving, not recklessly, not blindly, but with an understanding shaped by the last few days of enemy behavior. He has noticed patterns others still argue about. German units that disengage at first contact, command posts abandoned too quickly, roads clogged not with armor but with retreating support elements. This is not an army preparing to counterattack. It is an army trying to escape its own shadow. He does not chase victories. He chases time. He pushes before enemy officers can reconcile new orders with old reality. He advances into spaces that exist only briefly before the situation stabilizes again. Every hour matters. At 11:30 a.m., he diverts a column without notifying higher command. At 2:15 p.m., another road junction is secured. By nightfall, surrender numbers have doubled again. Each success increases the risk. Each pause would erase the advantage. The system behind him grows more alarmed as the results grow more impressive. This is the paradox now facing Allied command. To stop him might prevent a future disaster. To restrain him might also forfeit an opportunity that will never appear again. Doctrine says one thing, reality says another, and somewhere between those two forces, a decision is forming. not yet spoken, not yet written, but inevitable, whether to rein him in or let him run. By late afternoon, the pressure reaches a point where silence is no longer possible. Orders are drafted, carefully worded, conditional. They do not demand a halt, but they ask for clarification. They request confirmation of positions, strength, fuel, state. They ask questions the system always asks when it feels control slipping. The replies come back late. Not evasive, not defiant, simply incomplete. Positions have already changed. Distances no longer match the grid references sent hours earlier. Fuel estimates are obsolete almost as soon as they are written down. The unit is not outrunning the enemy alone. It is outrunning the reporting cycle meant to track it. At 5:20 p.m., a staff officer marks the latest confirmed location on the map and pauses. He checks the scale. He checks it again. That advance should have taken days. The room grows quiet in a way that signals danger, not awe. This is the quiet that precedes intervention. Someone suggests issuing a firm stop order. Another counters that such an order may arrive after the situation has already changed again. A third reminds the room that radio contact has been intermittent for hours. The system hesitates, and hesitation has consequences. On the ground, the man at the center of this does not frame his choices as rebellion or obedience. He frames them as timing. He knows that once higher command fully comprehends what is happening, the window will close. More units will be pulled in. Lines will be formalized. The enemy will regain coherence. Speed is not just movement now. It is survival. At 7:10 p.m., he receives a message that hints at restraint without stating it outright. The tone is polite, professional. It carries the weight of expectation rather than authority. He reads it once, then folds the paper and places it back into his map case. He does not stop. Instead, he changes direction. It is not the obvious move. The main roads are watched. The enemy expects pursuit along predictable routes. He turns onto secondary roads, narrower, less maintained places where retreating units tend to bunch together. These are not routes of advance in doctrine. They are routes of escape. And escape is exactly what the enemy is attempting. As darkness settles, the psychological effect becomes visible. German soldiers surrender without waiting for direct contact. White cloths appear at intersections before American units fully arrive. Officers approach cautiously, unsure whether the force in front of them is a fragment or the lead element of something far larger. Rumors spread faster than facts. Entire formations believe they have been bypassed. Others assume their flanks are already compromised. The absence of clear information becomes more powerful than any artillery barrage. This is the kind of collapse that cannot be scheduled. At 9:40 p.m., another report is sent upward. The prisoner count has increased again. The language is factual, almost understated. No embellishment, no commentary. Just numbers, locations, and timestamps written in the field. Higher command reads it with a growing sense of unease, because now the question is no longer whether the advance is dangerous. It is whether stopping it would be worse. If the unit is ordered to halt and the enemy regains coherence, the opportunity vanishes. The prisoners already taken remain a success, but the broader effect dissolves. The enemy learns, adapts, seals the gaps that were never meant to exist. If the unit is allowed to continue, the risks compound. Fuel will run out. Communications may fail entirely. A counterattack could isolate the spearhead beyond recovery. There is no option without cost. Near midnight, a senior officer traces a finger along the path the unit has taken so far. It does not resemble a front line. It looks more like a crack spreading through glass. Thin, irregular, and unstoppable once begun. This was never supposed to be possible. The system was designed to prevent exactly this scenario, to ensure that no single commander could create consequences beyond the ability of the structure to manage them. Yet, here it is unfolding anyway, not because of chaos, but because one man has correctly judged that the enemy is already more disorganized than the system trying to contain him. As the night deepens, the advance does not slow. Engines idle in short bursts. Orders are passed face to face. Maps are updated with pencil marks that may not matter by morning. Somewhere ahead, more German units are still trying to decide where the front actually is. Behind the system prepares to make a choice it has avoided all day, whether to pull him back into alignment or to accept that control has already slipped and the only remaining option is to follow where this momentum leads. By early afternoon, the advance reaches a threshold where concealment is no longer possible. At 1:10 p.m., a consolidated report reaches headquarters. Not fragmented field notes, not estimates. A compiled figure verified across multiple collection points. The prisoner count has crossed a number that forces silence again. Not because it is unbelievable now, but because it is undeniable. Entire German formations are no longer retreating. They are dissolving. Command elements surrender alongside enlisted men. Vehicles are abandoned with engines still warm. Maps are found marked with routes that no longer exist as viable paths. This is no longer momentum. It is systemic failure on the other side. Inside higher command, the tone hardens. This is the moment they feared and secretly anticipated. Success on a scale that demands ownership. To deny it would be dishonest. To embrace it would mean endorsing a method that bypassed the very controls designed to keep the war manageable. Someone asks whether the enemy might be staging a trap. The intelligence officers shake their heads. Intercepts show confusion, not coordination. Orders contradict one another. German commanders are requesting permission to retreat from positions already overrun. The enemy is not setting a snare. They are trying to understand where the front went. The decision arrives in fragments not as a single directive. No explicit approval, no formal endorsement. Instead, the absence of restraint. Silence where a stop order should have been. Delays where urgency once existed. It is permission by omission. On the ground, the message is understood immediately. He does not celebrate it. He does not slow down to consolidate gains for display. He recognizes the signal for what it is. A narrow corridor of tolerance granted reluctantly that could close at any moment. So he pushes again. At 2:40 p.m., a key junction falls with minimal resistance. German troops surrender before American units fully deploy. Their officers ask not about treatment, but about where they are being sent. The assumption of captivity is already accepted. This is the psychological endpoint of speed. The enemy no longer reacts to contact. They react to expectation. They surrender because every report they have received suggests resistance is pointless. They believe they are already surrounded even when they are not. This belief spreads faster than any column. Fuel trucks struggle to keep pace now. Drivers navigate roads clogged not by fighting, but by surrender. Prisoners are marched rearward in numbers that exceed the guarding units assigned to them. Improvised holding areas form along the advance, staffed by soldiers who were supposed to be moving forward an hour earlier. It is organized chaos barely contained by momentum alone. At 4:20 p.m., a staff officer at headquarters notes something unsettling. The advance has begun to shape the battlefield faster than adjacent units can adapt. Flanks are now protected not by friendly forces, but by enemy collapse. The geometry of the front is changing, pulled forward by a point that was never meant to lead. This is not how plans are executed. It is how realities force plans to catch up. There is concern now not just about isolation, but about exposure. If the enemy regains coherence even briefly, the consequences could be severe. A single counterattack against extended supply lines could undo everything. Yet no such counterattack materializes, because the enemy no longer knows where to strike. As evening approaches, the prisoner total rises again. The numbers strain credulity, even among those now inclined to believe. Each update reinforces the same conclusion. This is not a fluke. It is a cascading effect triggered by one factor alone: time. The faster the advance moves, the less time the enemy has to decide. The less time they have to decide, the more likely they are to surrender. Each surrender accelerates the next. A feedback loop forms, feeding on hesitation and uncertainty. This is warfare stripped to its psychological core. Near sunset, higher command drafts language for history even as events are still unfolding. Not proclamations, internal phrasing. How this will be explained once it can no longer be ignored. Words like initiative, exploitation, and opportunity begin to appear, replacing earlier terms like risk and overextension. The system is adapting, but slowly. Too slowly to control what is already in motion. The man at the center of it senses the shift again without seeing the paperwork. He knows the tolerance window will not last forever, that once this success is fully acknowledged, it will be constrained, formalized, and normalized. He has no intention of allowing that to happen yet. As darkness falls, he issues orders for continued pressure through the night, limited pushes, targeted objectives. No pause long enough for the enemy to regroup or for oversight to tighten. This is the final acceleration before the reckoning, because soon the system will demand an accounting. Soon, success will need a signature. And when that moment arrives, everything achieved without permission will either be claimed as doctrine or condemned as recklessness. Until then, the advance continues, measured not in miles, but in hours the enemy no longer has. Night compresses the battlefield into fragments of light and movement. Engines idle with headlights darkened. Orders are passed in low voices, face to face, because radios have become unreliable and records slow things down. The advance does not pause, but it changes character, less visible, more deliberate, a pressure that never fully lifts. At 10:30 p.m., an enemy column surrenders after a brief exchange that barely qualifies as contact. No artillery, no set-piece assault. The German officer in charge asks one question before handing over his sidearm. How far ahead are you? The answer is vague on purpose. Distance matters less now than perception. The enemy believes the space behind them is already closed. They believe the routes they plan to use no longer exist. And belief at this stage is enough. In headquarters, the night staff works under a different kind of strain. The success can no longer be contained within operational channels. Messages begin to move upward away from maps and into reputations. Each report carries implications for command authority, for doctrine, for how this war will be explained when it is over. No one wants to be responsible for stopping a breakthrough. No one wants to be responsible for owning it either. Shortly after midnight, a senior commander studies the map alone. He traces the line again. It still looks wrong, not because it is thin, but because it is alive. It bends where resistance appears and straightens where confusion reigns. It behaves less like a planned offensive and more like a current. This is not how systems think. Systems prefer edges, boundaries, named phases. This has none of those. It is success unfolding without labels, and that makes it dangerous to everyone involved. On the ground, the man driving this does not mistake tolerance for trust. He understands the silence above him is temporary, that once dawn comes, the pressure to formalize will return. Conferences will be scheduled, boundaries will be drawn. The moment will be turned into a lesson, and lessons always arrive after the opportunity has passed. So before dawn, he presses again. At 3:15 a.m., a reconnaissance element reports an enemy headquarters abandoned minutes earlier. Papers still on desks, radios left powered on, orders half written. The evidence is not of defeat, but of flight. This confirms what he suspected. The enemy is no longer reacting to contact. They are reacting to rumor. They are moving away from shadows, not units. The advance has become a presence rather than a position. He alters his approach once more, not to seize territory, but to sever expectation. He avoids heavily defended points that would slow momentum and targets intersections that force decisions. Every choice presented to the enemy must feel late. The results compound. By first light, surrender becomes procedural. Prisoners arrive in groups too large to question individually. Names are recorded where possible. Units are disarmed quickly and moved rearward to keep the road clear. The mechanics of captivity begin to strain not from resistance, but from volume. At 7:20 a.m., higher command finally sends a message that carries weight. It is respectful, measured. It requests a pause for assessment, not an order, a request framed as prudence. He reads it carefully. This is the edge of the tolerance window. He knows that continuing much longer risks forcing a hard stop that could shatter everything achieved so far. He also knows that pausing now allows the enemy a breath they have not had since this began. He chooses neither. Instead, he shifts tempo. The forward elements maintain pressure, while others begin to stabilize key points behind them. The appearance of consolidation without the reality of a halt. Movement continues, but in pulses. Enough to keep uncertainty alive. Enough to deny the enemy the clarity they need to regroup. It is a compromise designed to satisfy no one completely. And that is exactly why it works. At 9:50 a.m., the consolidated count reaches a figure that ends the argument whether anyone is ready or not. The scale forces acknowledgement beyond the operational level. This can no longer be treated as an anomaly or an exploitation at the edge of doctrine. It is now a fact that will require explanation. The corridor is no longer fragile. It is embedded. Other units begin to align their movements with it not by order, but by necessity. The battlefield reorganizes itself around the momentum already created. Control follows success, not the other way around. The system begins, finally, to move in the same direction as the man it has spent days trying to restrain. Orders are issued that sound like guidance but function as endorsement. Language shifts again. What was once dangerous becomes bold. What was once reckless becomes decisive. The man at the center of this notices the change without satisfaction, because he knows what comes next. Recognition brings limits. Limits bring delay. Delay ends moments like this. He has carried the advance to the point where it can survive without him acting ahead of permission. That was always the goal, even if no one else would say it. As mid-morning settles, the pressure he has applied begins to transfer fully into the system. The enemy's collapse is now visible on maps that everyone can agree on. The risk of isolation recedes as the front reshapes itself around the breach. The window is closing, not because the enemy is adapting, but because the war has caught up. By late morning, the shift becomes visible in small, telling ways. Orders begin to arrive with clearer language. Routes are referenced by name. Boundaries are defined. The advance is no longer something happening between reports. It is now something being managed. The system has arrived. At 11:40 a.m., a formal directive reaches the forward command post. It acknowledges success. It praises initiative. It outlines new coordination measures to stabilize gains. The phrasing is careful, balanced, almost flattering. It also sets limits. Nothing explicit is forbidden, but everything is framed. Objectives are reclassified. Movement is to be synchronized. Contact reports are now mandatory at fixed intervals. The language of control has returned quietly, but unmistakably. For most commanders, this would be the moment to exhale, to step back into alignment, to let the machine absorb the risk they have been carrying alone. The man who created this corridor understands the relief this offers, and he understands its cost. The enemy's behavior begins to change almost immediately. Not resistance yet. Awareness. German units no longer surrender at first contact. Some pull back in better order. Others delay just long enough to gather information before disengaging. The fog does not lift, but it thins. This is the first sign that the moment is passing. He feels it in the rhythm of the day, in how long it takes for reports to cycle, in the way enemy officers now ask specific questions instead of none at all. The shock has worn off. Confusion is giving way to adaptation. The collapse is slowing. At 1:30 p.m., he stands over a map that now looks far more conventional than it did 24 hours earlier. Lines are thicker. Symbols crowd the space that was once empty. The corridor he carved has been widened and reinforced, but also domesticated. It is safe now, and safety was never the point. He knows this phase of the war will be remembered as decisive. The numbers alone ensure that. Prisoners counted in the tens of thousands. Territory gained faster than anticipated. An enemy forced to abandon cohesion without a climactic battle. But he also knows something will be lost in the telling. The uncertainty, the risk, the hours where nothing was guaranteed except motion. The system will describe this as exploitation of opportunity. It will credit coordination doctrine and superior logistics catching up at the right time. It will smooth the edges until the story fits the shape it prefers. What it will not emphasize is how close this came to being stopped before it proved itself. Mid-afternoon brings the first explicit constraint. A neighboring unit is ordered to anchor its movement to his flank. This provides security, but it also fixes his position. The freedom to turn sharply to slip into spaces before they are noticed begins to vanish. He complies without protest. There is no benefit now in resistance. The moment for that has passed. Momentum has done its work. The breach is stable enough to survive institutional attention, At 3:50 p.m., a senior liaison arrives in person, not to reprimand, not to interrogate, to observe, to listen, to understand what happened well enough to explain it upward. They speak briefly, practically, about roads, fuel, enemy behavior, nothing philosophical, nothing emotional. But beneath the surface, both men understand what this meeting represents. The war has reclaimed ownership of the advance. As evening approaches, surrender numbers plateau. Still high, but no longer accelerating. The enemy has found a new rhythm, slower and more deliberate. The opportunity for cascading collapse has closed. This is not failure. It is transition. The system will now take what was gained and hold it. It will fortify, reorganize, and press forward again in a way that feels recognizable, effective, defensible. The man who forced the opening watches this process with a clarity that surprises even him. He does not feel pride. He feels distance, because the thing he did cannot be repeated on command. It required a precise alignment of fear, confusion, speed, and absence of oversight. Once recognized, it ceases to exist. By nightfall, his role has subtly changed. He is no longer ahead of events. He is inside them. One capable commander among many operating within a structure that now knows exactly where he is. The war moves on. But the question this moment raised does not. Whether the greatest accelerations in history happen because systems work perfectly, or because for a brief and dangerous span of hours, someone moves faster than the system can stop them. The reckoning does not arrive as confrontation. It arrives as paperwork. Within hours, summaries begin circulating. Clean language, structured paragraphs. What unfolded over days is compressed into phrases that sound orderly, almost inevitable. Rapid exploitation, enemy dislocation, exceptional initiative under fluid conditions. The words are accurate. They are also incomplete. What is missing are the hours when nothing was certain, the nights when fuel calculations were guesses, the moments when the difference between collapse and catastrophe rested on instinct rather than confirmation. Those details do not survive translation into doctrine. At headquarters, planners begin doing what planners do best. They look for patterns that can be repeated. They ask which elements can be standardized, which procedures can be formalized, which risks can be mitigated next time. They speak of speed as a principle. They do not speak of timing. Because timing is personal, it depends on judgment, on the willingness to act when information is insufficient and consequences are unknowable. Systems cannot teach that without also inviting disaster, so they do not try. The corridor is now fully absorbed into the broader front. Supply lines catch up. Artillery registers new positions. Infantry units rotate in to hold ground that was never meant to be held, only passed through. The chaos that once paralyzed the enemy is replaced by a slower, more predictable pressure. Effective, sustainable, ordinary. The surrender totals remain staggering, but they are treated now as outcomes, not catalysts. The war moves forward in ways that can be briefed, explained, and defended, and the man who forced this acceleration recedes. Not removed, not punished, simply repositioned. His name appears in reports without emphasis. His decisions are reframed as collective effort. The narrative widens until no single figure dominates it. This is how institutions protect themselves. Credit is distributed, risk is diluted, the lesson becomes safe. In quiet moments, some officers admit the truth among themselves. That the most dangerous part of the advance was not the enemy reaction, but the possibility that it might fail before proving itself. That had it stalled early, the same actions now praised would have been condemned. This realization is never written down. It cannot be. On the ground, the man who moved ahead of permission resumes a more conventional rhythm. He executes orders with precision. He coordinates as required. He becomes, once again, a reliable component in a vast machine. No one asks him to explain what he did in personal terms. No one asks how he knew when to push or when to turn. The system prefers outcomes to insight. Insight invites questions it does not want to answer. At dusk, as the battlefield settles into a new shape, he walks the edge of a captured junction that once represented everything. Soldiers move past him without recognition. For them, this is simply another phase in a long campaign. He watches traffic flow where resistance once collapsed and understands something with unusual clarity. The moment that mattered is already over. It existed in a narrow space between ignorance and control, between fear and adaptation, between orders not yet given and consequences already unfolding. Once named, it lost its power. This is the paradox of war that no manual can resolve, that the actions which accelerate history most violently are often those least compatible with the structures built to manage violence. Speed wins wars, but speed cannot be scheduled. Decision changes outcomes, but decision cannot be delegated. The system will remember this advance as a success. It will cite it as evidence of doctrine working under pressure. It will extract principles that fit neatly into future plans. What it will not remember is how close it came to stopping the very thing that made success possible. As night falls, the front quiets. The sound of engines fades into routine. The war resumes its relentless pace, measured once more in days and weeks rather than hours. The question this moment posed lingers unanswered and uncomfortable. Not whether the risk was justified, but whether history ever moves fastest when everyone agrees it should. Years later, the story appears in classrooms and staff colleges stripped of its sharp edges. Slides replace uncertainty. Arrows replace hours. The advance is presented as a logical sequence of actions, each flowing cleanly into the next. The outcome is highlighted. The cost is summarized. The risk is implied but never fully felt. It becomes a case study. Students are taught what to do when opportunity presents itself. They are shown how momentum can be exploited. They are reminded that initiative is a virtue, provided it operates within acceptable bounds. What they are not taught is how narrow those bounds were when this happened. How easily the entire episode could have been erased from the record had it stalled a single day earlier. How thin the margin was between being celebrated as decisive and condemned as irresponsible. History remembers success kindly. It does not remember how close failure stood to wearing the same uniform. The man at the center of it is mentioned occasionally, sometimes by name, sometimes only as a role. His actions are attributed upward, outward, redistributed until they fit the shape of collective effort. This is not malice, it is preservation. Institutions cannot afford to elevate behavior that cannot be safely repeated. So the lesson is softened. Speed is encouraged. Audacity is praised. But always with a reminder to coordinate, to confirm, to secure. The contradiction is never resolved. Because it cannot be. The truth is uncomfortable. That in this instance, coordination would have slowed the advance. Confirmation would have closed the window. Security would have given the enemy time to recover. Every safeguard that makes war manageable would have neutralized the very conditions that produced the result. This is not an argument against WWII systems. Systems win wars in the long run. They sustain pressure. They absorb loss. They endure. But they do not create moments like this. Those moments belong to individuals operating at the edge of tolerance, acting before permission, because permission arrives too late to matter. They are rare, dangerous, and impossible to plan for, which is why they are quietly reframed once they succeed. In private correspondence, some senior officers acknowledge this. They speak of fortunate timing, of unique enemy conditions, of circumstances unlikely to recur. These phrases are not criticism, they are containment. They ensure the story does not inspire imitation without restraint. The war itself moves on as wars do. New battles claim attention. New names rise and fall. The corridor that once unhinged an enemy front becomes a stabilized sector, then a footnote, then a line in a summary table. Yet the effect lingers in subtler ways. Enemy commanders, having survived the collapse, adjust their assumptions. They become more cautious, more centralized, less willing to trust fragmented reports. This slows them in later phases, even when conditions improve. The psychological wound does not heal cleanly. On the Allied side, confidence grows. Not reckless confidence, but belief. Belief that the enemy can be made to fold without annihilation. That speed can substitute for mass if applied at precisely the wrong moment for the other side. These beliefs shape decisions long after the episode itself fades. The man who forced the opening does not seek to correct the record. He understands the bargain implicitly. He was allowed to act beyond permission because the moment demanded it. In return, the system reclaims the story once the danger has passed. This is how equilibrium is restored. He continues his service, performs well, earns respect, but the sharp edge that defined those days is dulled by necessity. No institution can afford too many reminders that it was briefly outrun by one of its own. The final irony is quiet and enduring. The episode is cited as proof that doctrine works, even though it succeeded by violating it. It is taught as an example of controlled exploitation, even though control arrived only after the outcome was decided. Future commanders study the arrows and timelines convinced they understand the lesson. They do not, because the real lesson was never about movement on a map. It was about judgment under uncertainty, about recognizing when information is no longer worth waiting for, about accepting responsibility before outcomes are known. Those things cannot be reduced to diagrams. They can only be lived. And so the story settles into its final form. Clean, respectable, instructive. But beneath it remains a harder truth, visible only to those willing to look closely. That history does not bend because systems approve. It bends because for a brief and dangerous span, someone acts while the system is still deciding whether it should allow it. It ends where it began, with a line of text, long after the maps have been redrawn and the reports archived. That original message still exists in the record, not highlighted, not framed, just another entry among thousands. 18,000 enemy prisoners secured. By the time it becomes unremarkable, the danger it represented has already passed. What made that line extraordinary was never the number alone. It was the fact that when it appeared, no one yet knew whether it described triumph or impending disaster. It arrived before explanation, before justification, before permission. That is why it mattered. Wars are remembered through outcomes, but they are decided in moments like that. Moments when information lags behind reality. When the system hesitates not because it is weak, but because it is careful. And when care for a brief instant becomes the greater risk. The episode does not produce a revolution in doctrine. It does not rewrite manuals overnight. That would be too dangerous, too honest. Instead, it leaves a quiet imprint. A hesitation the next time someone asks whether speed can replace certainty. A pause before issuing a stop order when events on the ground feel strangely ahead of comprehension. These shifts are subtle. They do not announce themselves, but they accumulate. The war accelerates not because rules change, but because belief does. Belief that collapse does not always require annihilation. Belief that confusion can be exploited faster than resistance. Belief that sometimes the most decisive weapon is not firepower, but time denied. The man who created that moment fades further into the background. His career continues without spectacle. His name survives in footnotes and after-action reports. There is no singular monument to what he did because monuments prefer clarity, and this episode offers none. Was it bravery? Was it recklessness? Was it genius, or simply alignment with circumstances that will never repeat? The answer depends on where one stands in the system. That ambiguity is not a flaw in the story, it is the story. Because the most unsettling aspect of what happened is not that it succeeded, it is that it could just as easily have failed, and in doing so would have been erased rather than examined. History is written by outcomes, not intentions. But outcomes are born in moments when intention outruns approval. This is the tension that every institution must live with. To function, it must control action. To win, it must sometimes tolerate losing that control. The balance between the two is never stable. It shifts under pressure often without anyone realizing it has moved. The advance that produced those 18,000 prisoners sits precisely on that fault line. Not as a template, not as an instruction, but as a reminder that beneath every plan lies the assumption that someone somewhere will recognize when the plan is already obsolete, and that they will act before the ink dries on the order telling them not to. This is not a comfortable truth, which is why it is rarely spoken aloud. The war ends, systems are praised, lessons are codified, order is restored, but buried beneath the structure remains the memory of a brief interval when the structure was not leading but following. When history bent, not because it was guided, but because it was outrun. And that is the question this story leaves behind. Not whether it should have happened, but whether, if placed in the same moment, anyone else would have dared to move before the world was ready to explain why. The silence after victory is different from the silence before it. Before it was filled with doubt. After it is filled with distance. As the war moves toward its final chapters, this episode is rarely revisited in conversation. Not because it is forgotten, but because it does not fit easily into the narrative the war prefers to tell about itself. Clean progress, controlled advance, authority flowing downward in orderly fashion. What happened here flowed the other way. Those who witnessed it firsthand remember details that never made it into reports. The tempo of those days. The way decisions were made without ceremony. The absence of reassurance. The understanding that once momentum was lost, it would never be recovered in the same form. They remember how thin the margin felt, and they remember how alone it was. The man who carried that weight never speaks publicly about it. not out of secrecy, but because he understands something few articulate, that explaining such moments reduces them, that placing them into words invites judgment from those who were never inside the uncertainty. He knows the system does not want confession, it wants conclusion. So he lets the conclusion stand. In the years that follow, younger officers occasionally stumble across the numbers and pause. They ask how such an outcome was possible, without a corresponding battle name, without a famous clash to anchor it in memory. Their instructors give careful answers, contextual answers, answers that emphasize environment over individual action. This is deliberate. To focus on the individual would invite imitation without context. To emphasize the moment would risk encouraging decisions made without the necessary weight of consequence. War has enough chaos without institutionalizing defiance. Yet something survives even this careful framing, a quiet understanding that there are moments when certainty is a liability, when waiting for clarity ensures it never arrives, when the cost of action, however high, is still lower than the cost of hesitation. This understanding does not appear in manuals. It passes informally from one generation to the next in stories told, without names, in examples described without attribution. It survives because it must. The episode becomes one of those reference points officers carry privately, not as a plan to copy, but as a reminder of the limits of planning. A mental note filed away for circumstances that feel wrong, unstable, out of sequence, moments when the map no longer reflects the ground. In that sense, the advance achieves something more enduring than territorial gain. It introduces doubt into certainty, and doubt properly held sharpens judgment. The war ends, decorations are awarded, careers conclude. The system congratulates itself, and rightly so. It functioned under immense strain and prevailed, but beneath that success lies an unspoken acknowledgement that there are victories no system can schedule, that some outcomes emerge not because they are authorized, but because they are seized in the narrow space before authorization becomes possible. These victories are uncomfortable. They resist repetition. They do not lend themselves to slogans or doctrine, which is precisely why they matter. They remind those who study war that beneath every structure lies a human element that cannot be reduced, regulated, or fully predicted. A capacity for judgment that under the right pressure can move faster than any chain of command. The story does not demand admiration. It demands honesty about the fragility of control, about the cost of certainty, about the fact that history's sharpest turns are often taken without signaling. This is not an argument for chaos. It is a recognition of reality, that when the moment arrives, the system will always lag behind it, and that the difference between collapse and transformation may rest with someone willing to act while the world is still deciding what it is seeing. That truth does not expire with the war. It waits. The last trace of the moment disappears not with debate, but with time. As months pass, urgency gives way to memory, and memory reshapes itself into something easier to carry. The war continues to demand attention elsewhere. New offensives begin, new crises form. The episode that once froze rooms into silence becomes one success among many. This is how war closes its own wounds. The system absorbs what challenged it and moves forward intact. It does not deny what happened. It simply places it at a distance where it can no longer threaten balance. The advance becomes a reference point, not a reckoning, And yet for those who were close enough, something lingers. Not pride, not regret, but awareness. An understanding that there was a moment when the war could have turned sharply in either direction. When the difference between catastrophe and acceleration rested on judgment made without confirmation, without safety, without consensus. That awareness changes how a person sees command forever. Because once someone has stood inside that uncertainty and acted, everything afterward feels different. Orders sound clearer, procedures feel heavier. The margin between rule and reality becomes visible in a way it never was before. The man who acted ahead of permission carries that knowledge quietly. He does not seek to prove it. He does not argue for it. He simply recognizes it when situations echo that same instability, when the rhythm of events begins to outrun explanation. And in those moments, he understands what is truly rare in war. Not courage, not intelligence, but timing. The ability to sense when waiting will cost more than acting. When information has reached the point of diminishing return. When the world will not pause long enough to be fully understood before it changes again. This cannot be taught directly. It can only be learned once under pressure and remembered. That is why this story matters even without a name attached to it, even without a monument or a doctrine to preserve it. It exists as a reminder rather than a lesson. A reminder that history does not always announce itself in advance, that its most decisive movements often begin as anomalies dismissed at first as errors or exaggerations, and that somewhere in the noise of uncertainty, someone must decide whether to step forward before the moment passes. The war ends, the system survives, order reasserts itself. But beneath that order lies a permanent truth. That control is never absolute, that certainty is never complete, that progress at its most decisive is often made by those willing to act while the rest are still checking their maps. This is not an invitation to defiance. It is a recognition of responsibility. Because when the next moment arrives, and it always does, the question will not be whether permission exists. It will be whether anyone is prepared to carry the weight of acting without it.